Are you listening? Damn.
Welcome back to another episode of Monkey Wrench Garage.
Yeah.
Today we're replacing the inner and outer front wheel bearings of a 1995 Ford F-150. Before we get started, put it in park on level ground. We'll be raising the front left wheel using a jack and a jack stand for safety. Now let's not forget to chalk those rear wheels. Because the shop's floor jack sprang a couple leaks today, we'll be using the bottle jack from behind the seat. Okay, let's get started by seating the jack. Raise to put pressure on the jack, but do not lift the tire off the ground yet. And slide a jack stand under the frame. Use a breaker bar and a 19mm socket to break the lug. If you don't have a breaker bar, there's most likely a roadside lug nut wrench in the vehicle next to the jack. Now with the lug nuts loosened, let's roll back onto the truck and get this wheel off the ground. Raise the jack until the wheel is off the ground and can freely spin. Be sure to adjust your jack stand to the vehicle's new height. Back to the outside of the wheel, let's remove this cover. It's secured with 3 flat tip screws. Now we can remove the loosened lug nuts easily by hand. Remove the wheel and set it to the side. Using a 13mm socket, remove the 2 guide pin bolts located in the inboard side of the brake caliper. The 2 guide pins removed, slide off the caliper. Avoid stretching or kinking the brake line. Using a bungee, wire, or zip tie, hang the caliper onto the coil spring. Now with the caliper out of the way, pop off those brake pads, check for wear. If they're worn, it would be a great time to swap them out with some brand new ones. To remove the dust cap, insert a slotted tip screwdriver between the lip of the dust cap and the rotor, slightly twisting as you go around. With a flat tip screwdriver, pry out the cotter pin. Use a pair of dikes to continue straightening out the cotter pin. And then pull out the pin. Next, remove the axle nut retainer. Retainer stops the axle nut from loosening when a cotter pin is installed through its castellated tabs. With a socket or a wrench, remove the 1 1/16 inch retaining nut. Press on the rotor and the outer bearing will pop right out. With the rotor now removed, you'll be able to see the inner wheel bearing, which we'll be removing next. At this point, it will be a great opportunity to inspect the front spindle. Remove any old dirty grease and look for any excessive wear or damage that might be present. To remove the inner wheel bearing, we're going to reinstall the retaining nut. Take your rotor, halfway reinstall it, pull down while pulling out, and allow the nut to catch the bearing as you come out. The seal in the bearing should just pop out. With both bearings out, it's time to remove and replace the races. Starting with the outer race, flip the rotor onto some wooden block. Using a drip punch or a flat blade screwdriver, tap your way around the race. Install the new outer race, flip the rotor. Install the new race, we'll be using a bearing, race, and seal setting driver kit. This kit consists of multiple tapered and collared discs to fit around multiple different size races. a handle to hold and to tap, and a bolt to hold it all together. Using your new race, find the best matching disc to fit around the taperedness and the collar of the race's lip. Attach the handle, disc, and bolt. Place a new race on top of the hub. With the tool, line it up to drive it in straight. Give it a couple taps to start. And if everything looks straight and level, break out the mallet and drive it in. You'll hear and feel the difference when you're bottomed out. And now we'll repeat the same steps for the inner bearing race. Use a drift punch or a flat blade screwdriver and work your way around the race's lip. Find the right disc for the inner bearing race, paying attention to the taperness of the disc and the race, with the collar of the disc fitting around the race's edge. Now that you've found the correct disc, assemble the tool and let's get this inner bearing race in. Okay, let's start off by giving it a couple light taps as you drive it in. If it looks leveled and balanced, continue driving it in until it's bottomed out. You'll notice when it's bottomed out by the sound and feel of the hammering. At this point, we're done with the usage of the bearing race seal driving tool. So pack it up and get it out of the way. Now it's time to get those bearings greased for installation. Start with a glob of grease on the palm of your hand. What we are doing here is pushing and forcing the grease through one side of the bearing, through the rollers, and out the other side of the bearing. Slowly working your way around the 360 degree of the bearing. Then take up the axis, flip it around, and work it through the other way. Being sure to work in as much grease to the bearing as possible. The bearing all greased up, let's set it aside and get the bearing seal and give that a coating too. Take a big fingerful of grease and smother that inner bearing race. It's time to grab that greasy inner bearing, insert it into the race, and pop that seal on. Tap your way around the seal until it's fully inserted. For this job, we're using Mobil 1 synthetic grease. It's great for wheel bearings, chassis, suspension, and universal joints. It protects from temperatures of -40 to over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Now let's grease that outer bearing. Glob of grease, palm of your hand, work the grease, force it through one side of the bearing, through the rollers to the other side of the bearing. Flip it around, work it around, coat it nice and good, pack as much grease as you can in there as possible. With that outer bearing packed and smothered with grease, let's flip the rotor over. Scoop out a fingerful of grease and smother that outer bearing race. Grab the greased up outer bearing and insert it onto the race inside the hub. Back to the spindle, apply a light coat of grease to help with insulation. Anything more would just be a waste of grease. Install the rotor by sliding it over the spindle. Push in the outer bearing. Install the washer by lining up the flats. And here's the most critical part of this job. Snug down the 1 1/16 inch nut so you can seat the bearings onto the hub, but then slightly back off the nut. You want there to be resistance. Ideally, you want to be able to use your finger and spin it around and have it stop between the first and second spin. Install the axle nut retainer over the 1 1/16 nut. Before installing the cotter pin, give the rotor a little snug left to right and up and down. See if there's any play. If there's no play present, install the cotter pin. Take the longer tab of the cotter pin and bend it over the top. The dust cap is a pinch fit, so to install it until lip is seated against the hub. Wipe off any grease off the rotor. Once this grease is wiped off, come back with a little brake cleaner and spray down the rotor and wipe again, ensuring that all grease is off the brake pads. Greasy rotors and brake pads are not a good mix, so wipe them well. Time to slide those brake pads back on. If you are installing new pads, be sure to install new pads on both front tires. Slide the caliper over the brake pads. If installing new pads, a caliper compression tool helps push in the piston to slide the caliper over the thicker pads. Reinstall the two 13mm caliper guide pin bolts and torque them to 25 to 30 foot-pounds. Now it's time to roll over that wheel and throw it back on. Reinstall the 5 lug nuts by hand to avoid cross-threading and damaging your studs. With all lug nuts started, tighten the wheel to the hub. Use a start pattern and rotate the tire until firmly against the hub. Back under the vehicle, reach under and release the jack stand and remove it from under the vehicle. Lower the jack stand just enough for the tire to make contact with the ground and not turn. Using a torque wrench, tighten the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Use a star pattern to evenly tighten the wheel. And finally, now let's lower the truck and get rid of that jack. Once the jack is unseated, slide it out. And finally, the last thing to do is replace the wheel cover. Using a slotted flat tip screwdriver, snug down the 3 cover screws. Don't forget to remove the chocks from the rear wheels. And just like that, you replace your inner and outer wheel bearing on your F-150. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification to stay up with the latest in Monkey Wrench Garage.